Well, good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of Finweek Money Matters, the show that helps you manage your finances. I'm Samantha Loring. My co-host is Mark Ashton, editor of Finweek. Well, coming up on the show today, we're discussing electric vehicles in South Africa, the challenges the industry may face as South Africa and government very much hopes to incentivize manufacturing of electric vehicles on local shores. And then South Africa has a 3.5 billion rand shared vacation ownership industry. We look at this lucrative vacation club industry and also the fact that it's being investigated in South Africa. And then FNB's Michael Jordan is going to be stepping down as the bank CEO at the end of this year. We'll be taking a look at his illustrious career at the bank and taking a look at what we can learn from his very specific management style. If you have any comments for us or any feedback, please do send it through to moneymatters@abn360.com. Well, earlier this week, it was announced that Nissan had signed a deal with Eskom. That's to look at the impact of electric cars on the South African economy. This is an interesting announcement because electric cars are a big deal in the US at the moment, with Tesla being in the headlines. And of course, Tesla started by a South African. So in its cover story this week, Finweek looked at the electric vehicle industry and whether or not South African consumer will give it the green light. Joining us to discuss this, Mark Ashton, Finweek editor, Tanzi Sizwe Mahluchana, Finweek deputy editor, Guy Kilfoyle. He's the GM he's from GM for communications and public affairs at BMW South Africa, and then Ross Garvey, Nissan's chief marketing manager for electric vehicles. Thanks so much for joining us today. Mark, just very quickly, I suppose it is an important week for South Africa when it comes to going green, because we had the startup of a power plant, a solar power plant here this week. But this is kind of a new industry, a very niche industry. It's set to be something government's focusing on, but I suppose the question mark is whether it will be commercially viable.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. We were just chatting a little bit off air about how long these projects have been taking. Specifically, we're talking about Nissan Eskom, just about these projects being rolled out. And then suddenly this week, everything has literally seemed to align. We've had green projects, big green projects announced. We've seen the Eskom Nissan deal. Tesla is simply shooting the lights out at the moment. You can't open up a business news site at the moment and not see the word Tesla.
Or Elon Musk.
And I think it's just everything's aligned. And suddenly people are saying, heck, this might actually be a really cool big industry. And I think one of the issues that's faced it so far has been very, very fragmented. You know, there's been a couple of nice little initiatives, but everybody's kind of given it the, yes, it's a nice thing, but it's not really going to replace fuel-driven cars in either Europe or in developing markets like South Africa. So we started looking about the incentives and you know, can we actually make this into an industry that South Africa could be good at and something that the consumers would adopt. And you know, we get the sense that yes, the answer is that there's possibly something there, but it's not going to suddenly shoot the lights out in the next couple of years. This is something that's got a long-term payoff.
Mm-hmm. Just very quickly, let's touch on the deal with that Nissan has with Eskom right now and just the background to that. Before we take a look at the global industry, just kind of give us the background to that agreement you've got.
Well, the deal with Eskom is more of a testing project. That's specifically Eskom's requirement to test impact of electric cars on their grid. I know they've got a long-term plan to develop a similar type of smart grid like you see in other countries.
And a smart grid is, for all of the laymen?
Well, potentially it allows Eskom to manage the flow of electricity between different components on their grid. So in a smart grid, you would, for instance, be able to turn on or turn off electric vehicle chargers. So instead of seeing the adverts on TV telling you to switch off your electric car, they might just do it for you at some stage in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Eskom's testing the viability and the impact it's going to have on electricity demand and all of that. In a global context, Guy, just give us a view in terms of the current state of the electric vehicle market right now. I mean, is it booming? Where are the key points where you are seeing growth?
Well, I think Mark touched on it and he said, is the electric car going to replace fuel in the short-term future? And the answer is no. I think we're looking at an industry and a global market for cars that's not about either or, it's about and. Mm-hmm. It's about internal combustion engines and hybrid and electric cars and fuel cells and other alternative drivetrains. How big can this get? Well, we have very small projections. You know, nobody really knows how big electric cars can go. Tesla's doing well in the US. Nissan's doing very well in the US and Japan as well with the Leaf. We only launch our car in July this year internationally, but the projections are anywhere between 5 and 15% of the global market by 2020. That's a very big space to play in, that sort of size of
So when it
market.
comes to R&D right now and strategic focus, resource focus, how much focus is going into it from BMW's perspective globally?
Well, R&D is a huge part of this process. Manufacturers have two pressure sources at the moment. They're under huge pressure to optimize the internal combustion engine. That costs a lot of money. On the other hand, they're looking at electric vehicles and hybrids, and that also costs a lot of money. So if you look at just what we're spending on the BMW i project, it's around 3 billion euros in R&D at this point in time. So it's a massive part of our R&D focus. It's taking up a lot of resources, and it means that companies have to run very sustainably in order to generate the profits to create an R&D supply stream to fuel these vehicles.
I think one of the questions, though, is, if you bring a new petrol-driven car into the market is easy. The infrastructure is there. You've got petrol stations, you've got spare parts, you've got manufacturing capacity on everything that's there. Bringing electric cars requires infrastructure. It's not just about a case of rolling out a model. And I guess questions to both of you is, what infrastructure have we got in place, and what do we need to sort of get to the 15% market share that we were discussing?
Well, Mark, let me answer that, since Nissan is probably going to be first to market with the product in South Africa. Our intention is to launch before the end of this year.
And that's the Nissan Leaf?
That's the Nissan Leaf, which is, that's our global electric vehicle, which to date we've sold just short of 70,000 of these globally. So there's some best practice knowledge that we've got from a number of key markets overseas. And you're right, infrastructure is one of those things that determines the success in any market of the product. But it's always the chicken and egg scenario. And what we found in a number of markets is that the vehicle is the catalyst for that infrastructure to develop. So from Nissan's perspective, our key driver has to be first in every market to introduce the product, and then the infrastructure develops around that. Until you have a decent sales volume, there's no reason for anyone to put in an infrastructure that costs quite a bit of money.
And what's that decent sales volume in a South African context?
Well, as Guy said, I think it starts very small, but I think there's growth potential. So in our market, it might be slightly different to first world markets where there's big individual consumer demand. In South Africa, I think there's probably a bigger corporate and fleet market initially for electric vehicles, rentals as well. So companies that have the capacity to put a decent upfront investment into infrastructure and equipment and amortize that over the life cycle of owning a vehicle, that makes a lot of sense when you go electric because of the cost savings that you have with electricity versus fuel. And ideally, the running costs over a 2 to 3 year period of an electric vehicle are substantially lower than a petrol vehicle. There's a lot less maintenance. So there's a whole value chain that you take into consideration with electric cars. It's not just a product, it's creating a value chain around it and the ecosystem to support it. And a number of other economic opportunities come from that, both downstream and upstream, whether it be in parts supply, charging station setup, revenues that banks can generate via fleet sales of electric cars. There's a whole number of things. So South African market, it's a kind of a wait and see and a toe in the water situation for both of us, I think. But there's definitely growth opportunity, and the fact is, unless somebody takes that leap, we're never going to know, and it's never going to develop. So we certainly don't want to be left behind, and that's, I think, the government's intention too. So Department of Trade and Industry is taking the lead on a EV policy framework, which definitely has the right sounding terms in it. What comes to policy at the end of the day is still to be finalized, but we're getting there slowly.
I think I put it nicely earlier when they said it's not a case of either or, it's a case of and, so it's an addition to what we already have. But my question is, already consumers are obviously cash strapped. So if we add on this extra layer of cost, and I think that electronic vehicles or cars are not going to be cheaper to buy, the same model that is obviously fuel powered. And my question is, so you have this car that's fuel powered, and you have to add on an extra car, because I don't think that electronic vehicles can go the distance. I think it's vehicles that are made for city driving, and I think we saw it in New York. Prius is doing very well amongst the city, but if you go a longer distance, then you won't really be driving an electronic powered car. So how much more cost will the consumer have to bear?
Okay, I mean, I think you have to look at it in the context of the entire market. So yes, there is an additional cost, but that's the same for any technology. And
Give us an idea. I mean, talking percentage terms right now.
So I can't compare the Nissan versus the BMW. We have two fundamentally different production techniques. We're going to build a car out of carbon fiber. It's going to weigh about 500 to 600 kilograms less than any equivalent electric car ever built before, which allows us to have smaller batteries. Be the most integrated car in the world in terms of with the outside world through your smartphone and through your home PC. The three will be completely integrated, and that car will probably cost 25 to 30% more expensive than an equivalent sized 1 Series. So that's quite a big investment, but you've got to look at it over the life cycle of the car. We're also producing the car in a completely sustainable way. We're using only renewable energy to produce the carbon fiber in Moses Lake in Washington, for example. Our plant in Leipzig that will build these cars is running on wind and solar power only. So 50% less production life cycle CO2 emissions, and then factor in the fact that a full charge on a car is going to cost you about, at today's electricity prices, 25 to 30 Rand to give you a range of between 160 and 180 kilometers. There's no way a fuel-driven car can deliver that sort of low-cost day-to-day motoring for the average consumer. If you're a consumer that, in our case, is a premium consumer and already has a multiple car household, it makes a lot of sense to change one of your smaller daily commuter cars for a car that's running on such a low cost base, because you'll see the amortization of that cost very quickly.
South Africa is, an area where we have urban areas, of course, and, Johannesburg, key metropolitan areas, but then we also have distances that we have to travel to get from one big city to the next. So is that an issue that is going to limit the growth of the industry here in South Africa? What is your thoughts in terms of getting around the range issue right now that is holding back electric vehicles?
I think the range issue is something in South African context which is maybe similar to the Californian one. So in Europe and Japan, there's a lot less driving distance. People live in the city centre. California is quite a similar situation to Johannesburg and Pretoria. And as Guy mentioned, it's more a multi-vehicle household. So this is not a car for a single person who doesn't have another vehicle in the household. So
when you say multi-vehicle, it sounds like, upper LSM we're talking about here.
Definitely is, yeah.
For how long? I mean, we're supposed to deal with the range issue first, and then we'll go
right,
into
so
price.
the range issue really doesn't impact. Our studies show that about 80% of drivers in the Gauteng area don't travel more than 100 kilometers a day to and from work. So it can work for around 80% of people today, as long as you've got the capacity to charge at home every night, just like you do. We've all learned to do that with our cell phones so that we can make calls the next day. It's about changing habits. So rather let the vehicle charge while you sleep than have to pull into the petrol station tomorrow morning on your way to work. It's just a change in behavior.
And there are solutions to those problems as well. I think electric cars are not only about vehicles, they're about mobility services as well. So companies like BMW and Nissan are investing in venture capital companies that are producing apps and systems for mobility in a city environment. Just as one example, with BMW i, when we do launch, we'll offer a service to a customer where 10 times, well, we haven't decided on the number yet, but let's say up to 10 times a year, he can drop off his i3 at a dealer and exchange it for an X3 for a few days so that he can take a 500 or 600 kilometer journey with his family. There are many other examples of how these apps will work. An app that allows me to communicate with Ross, who's parked his Leaf at a charging station. He's having lunch, so he's there for a little bit of time. I'm in a hurry. I need 10 minutes of charge to get to my destination. Through an app, I can communicate with him and his car to tell him that I'm pulling the plug out, putting it in mine, paying for my electricity as I charge and putting the plug back into his car. So it's an interconnected system that you have to see working here. And I can preempt Mark's question. He says, surely it then works with a big public transport system. And
it does on some wavelength.
Yes, it does.
I was actually going to, because Sam's a girl, she probably wouldn't ask this question like this. But
I'm always me against four men. Why is this on Finweek?
So it's a bit of an ego question, but it's also, I guess, a lifestyle research question. I mean, South Africans are very passionate about their cars, and I mean, I've got a V6. You guys have got your M range. Guys like powerful cars, and I think that one of the perceptions of electric cars is that they are very much dinky, and they don't have the power that you don't have that enjoyment factor. what's the research show globally? Are people interested in it from a drive perspective?
For the record, that question was actually on my piece of paper. But anyway.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in and just say that as BMW, we've built a 95-year reputation on performance and driving pleasure.
Yeah.
There's no way we would bring a car to market that didn't deliver driving performance and driving pleasure. The i3, for example, will perform like a Mini Cooper S does. So it's certainly got enough performance, and if you've ever driven an electric car, you know you don't have to rev it to get a great deal of acceleration out of it. Torque is instant. But at the same time, and this is really our belief from a BMW perspective and in terms of BMW i, what we're doing, you have to see sustainable motoring as sexy. So the i3 is really our city car, our mega city vehicle. It's a daily commuter, but on the other hand of the range, we're going to build a car called the i8, which is a plug-in electric hybrid that can run for 60 kilometers on pure electric mode, but it's basically a green supercar.
Okay.
Does 0 to 100 in 4.5 seconds, but uses less than 3 liters of fuel per 100 Ks. And that's a sexy car, gull-wing doors made out of carbon fiber. And that balances both sides of that equation.
And Ross, from Nissan's side?
Well, that's actually one of the surprise and delight factors for a number of Nissan Leaf customers overseas. We wouldn't have sold close to 70,000 of them if there wasn't surprising and really great performance from the vehicle. So, I mean, the performance of an electric car is completely different to that of a petrol car. And I think most people just not having the awareness or exposure to it is maybe what drives that initial perception. But let's just say it is wrong, because electric power is instantaneous. You've got amazing acceleration from an electric vehicle. And companies like Tesla are proving that through the kind of vehicles that they are marketing and producing, which is all about performance.
I'd like to go a little left for a moment. So with South Africa being a developing state, one would believe that, or one would like to believe that, when our government spends money on investment in developing the country in terms of innovation and all of those things, it has to go back to things like job creation.
Tandi Caesar, we have a problem with your mic. We're going to get that fixed. So we'll come back to that question. Perhaps we could just jump to environmental legislation globally right now and where South Africa is in that context. Because at this point in time, you've got, I suppose, Europe is very much at the forefront of that. Do you find that South Africa is following suit from Europe? Is that also driving the electric vehicle market to a degree? Because you've got taxation and all of those elements that are incentivizing, greener behavior.
South Africa is actually one of the most first world legislative environments compared to our third world development state, if you have to put it that way. So from both economic policy and also green policy, our government is actually far ahead of a number of other countries. And the kind of legislation that we can see coming is the carbon tax in 2015. So there's a whole number of initiatives from government to get corporates and people to behave more responsibly. I guess the difference with South Africa is the regulatory environment is very advanced, but the enforcement of it is difficult to manage because of the resources that we have. So that's one of the issues. But government's intention to put an EV industry roadmap in, I think, is a clear indication of where they're going relating to electric cars.
Is it critical though? Is it part of the element, part of the mix that is going to drive this niche new market in South Africa?
Absolutely. I think the best example of that is Finland, Sweden, those kind of Nordic countries where the government policy has driven electric vehicle market to develop to a state where it's actually outselling a lot of petrol cars at the moment. Now that's a similar sized market in the Nordics to what we have in South Africa. So you can see the potential volume if government policy plays a part in driving consumer behavior.
And you can already see it in the market, So since the implementation of the CO2 tax a few years ago, we've noticed a huge uptick in diesel sales. So we've gone from 10 or 15% of the BMW 3 Series range being sold as diesel, and we're up to now 35%. 5 Series is nearly 55% diesel, which was never the case before, and that's driven purely by the fact that a guy can get much lower fuel consumption and then doesn't have to pay a big CO2 taxation when he's buying his car.
What about government subsidy though on these vehicles? I mean, that seems to be the difference maker in terms of pricing, is that you've got to say to them, if government comes to the party and says, I'll actually reward you for buying these kind of vehicles, whether it's a tax subsidy, whether it's a manufacturer's subsidy or something that goes directly to the consumer, Where is the, how important is that going to be in terms of driving market and take-up?
I think it is important. It's also the one area where Nissan and BMW are divergently opposite in our viewpoints, I won't speak for Ross, he can speak for himself in a second. But from our point of view, it's not necessarily about incentivizing the customer up front at purchase price, but it's about getting that cost of ownership delta as close as possible to a normal petrol or diesel powered car. So for us,
through the subsidization of manufacturers,
not necessarily through the subsidization of manufacturers, but it might be through tax advantages on your income tax return. It might be on the case of, and this is a very blue sky thought, an electric vehicle doesn't get e-tolled, for example, so that you can start adding up the cost savings to justify the initial investment.
Because our two are sold.
Yeah. We're getting a mic for you to understand, so I feel terrible out here. So when it comes to South, what is your position on that, on the intent, or basically on what Ross had said?
No, I'm Ross.
Ross,
anyway,
sorry.
What Guy said is important. I think there is a difference of view when you speak to different manufacturers. From Nissan's perspective, it is one of the things that has driven volume in a number of other markets. But it's not necessarily the critical factor for us to determine, are we going to introduce the vehicle in a market? And that's clear. We're going ahead with our plans to launch Nissan Leaf, with or without government incentive to the consumer, because we believe that at some stage the demand will need to drive government policy and it will catch up to support that.
How important is South Africa's market just generally right now to Nissan globally? And does Africa have an underpin to that?
Absolutely. The Nissan structure has changed in such a way that South Africa is actually the key market to drive a lot of business growth in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So as far as Nissan's concerned, Africa is a big development area for us, and that growth will be driven and managed from South Africa as a regional hub. So absolutely critical to Nissan's business.
We have been given the green light for your microphone.
Oh, thank you. Well, just to go back to my quick question quickly, I just wanted to understand from the roadmap that has been developed, what are the thoughts around things like job creation and just general development of South Africa, not at that higher level, but at that level that needs, the most development or developing.
Okay. South Africa's got a very well supported motor industry from a government policy point of view. The Minister, Rob Davies' announcement the other day of the EV industry roadmap clearly underpins that, and part of the incentive structure that he's looking at offering to manufacturers is if you reach a certain volume of locally produced vehicles or components, there is some subsidy to be had, and through that he hopes to create a lot of jobs. I think it's possibly premature to put an incentive like that into the market on a large scale, because the EV industry still has to grow from a zero base. So it's going to take some time before we can realize the volumes that are proposed in such a plan.
Because the volumes at this point in time is 5,000 cars.
Correct.
So what are you earmarking right now in terms of production?
We're definitely not going to produce from the start. I mean, as we say, Nissan's invested in 3 main plants around the world, and we're a global sourcing company. So we would
importing.
We're an importer for electric vehicles right now. We have a big production facility right across the road from BMW in Pretoria, but most of our exports are of commercial vehicles. So it doesn't make sense for us to invest in a production facility right now for electric vehicles, but who knows, if the market grows to such a state where it's viable, then we could consider that.
Yeah, we're in a similar position. Our global production capacity for BMW I is only 50,000 units a year, all of which is serviced out of a plant in Leipzig, where we've spent, as I said to you, €3 billion in R&D and investment. So that's not going to move in a hurry. Where I think the opportunities lie are in battery development, not necessarily from a manufacturer perspective, but from a supplier perspective. If you look at what's going on in the world at the moment, a lot of the prognosis for battery development is that an electric car like a Leaf or an i3 within 5 to 7 years could double or triple its range, based purely on battery developments and eureka moments in battery labs around the world.
Is it the cost right now? I mean, what are the issues with batteries, and that Tesla's also got a kind of some model here that it's using?
It's not necessarily about the cost of the development as such, but it's about the technology that's related to the battery. The battery can only hold so much charge at the moment. To have more charge, it needs to be bigger. If it's bigger, the car becomes heavier. If the car's heavier, you have packaging issues, you've got space issues, you've got dynamic issues. So it's all about getting a smaller battery to carry the same amount of charge, which will allow you to pack smaller batteries into the space in the car and thus increase the range.
What about marketing? Because one of the things that I think is, Ross touched on it, about you don't market this to an individual, you actually market it to the companies. But from a sustainability perspective, it's nice to be able to roll out a fleet of EVs, to be able to say, we are a green company, we adopt these as our fleet cars. Is that the strategy in South Africa? You're going to go after the corporate and maybe the rental market before you're trying to target individual consumer, mass market consumer?
I don't want to play all my marketing cards in front of Guy before we launch, but...
you've got a year's advantage, you may as well go ahead.
Doesn't have a car yet to sell.
I mean, marketing is one of the reasons to introduce the product. If your strategy is to be first to market and capture that initial image of being a market leader, then the introduction of an electric car can play a big part in that. So definitely on a corporate and fleet basis, that's far more a business discussion. But of course, Nissan Leaf is one of the global brand products for Nissan.